Welcome. For those of you who are just joining us, today is National Council of Jewish Women of Canada's annual meeting. I am Debbie Wasserman and I'm the president of National Council. As the highlight of our day, we are so honored to be able to welcome the Honorable Irwin Cotler as our keynote speaker. Recognizing the fact that our meeting is spread out throughout Canada and in many cases will occur on the traditional territories of the First Peoples, we would like to acknowledge this as a sign of recognition and respect. This statement supports the protocol that is customary when one First Nation and another meet on or within the traditional territory of a First Nation. Professor Cotler's wisdom, experience, and commitment to international human rights issues are very well known. Dr. Cotler has been the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, a longtime member of Parliament, and is an international human rights lawyer. Currently, Dr. Irwin Cotler is the International Chair of the Rael Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and an Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University. In 2020, the Government of Canada established the Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Just this past Wednesday, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that the government will be making this role permanent. Since 2020, Dr. Cotler has served in this role. Today, Dr. Cotler's choice of topic is the Durban legacy of hate, 20 years later, what needs to be done. This is sure to inspire us to act against the growing anti-Jewish rhetoric and behavior all over the world. All of you will be muted throughout this webinar. If you have questions to pose, please type your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen, and there will be time at the end to address a selection of your questions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cotler. Welcome. Let me just unmute you. Just a second.
It's okay, I'm unmuted.
Good, welcome.
Thank you. And let me begin by thanking you for those very kind words of introduction, and also to commend you on the earlier webinar that you had on journalists and human rights, which we were delighted at the RWCHR to co-sponsor with you. And I want to use this opportunity to express a continuing refuah shlema for Debbie Altra, who was so much engaged in all your work and in the preparation of this particular forum. So thank you for your introduction, like the two Debbies, and I feel very much at home in your company and with your group, which does such an incredible work. We meet today really at an important, I would say almost historical inflection moment, where we are experiencing at one and the same time 4 pandemics. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused untold human suffering and death that has targeted, in particular, the most vulnerable amongst our community, that has targeted those who have been frontline workers as well, women, children, and minorities caught up in their wake, in their disproportionate impact. And what is not always appreciated, that the COVID-19 pandemic has instrumentalized one of the more ancient tropes of the Jews as the poisoners of the wells, where Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel are being blamed for manufacturing the virus, for causing its spread, and even from profiting from it. And vaccines come into it as part of the Jewish profit dimension, as the anti-vaxxers then pose as if they were victims of Nazi persecution, a pattern of Holocaust distortion, trivialization, and minimalization. So the first pandemic has its own fallout with respect to the pandemic of anti-Semitism that I will get to in a moment. And this comes to the second pandemic, which is the pandemic of systemic racism, where we are experiencing here in Canada systemic racism against Indigenous people, dramatized by the discovery of unmarked graves, systemic racism against Black people and people of color, against Asian Canadians, against the Muslim community, but where anti-Semitism emerges not only as the oldest and most enduring and most lethal of hatreds, but one which has taken on a particular virulence in a global sense and even reached a tipping point during the Hamas war against Israel, where, as we saw, Jews were targeted and threatened in their own neighborhoods and on their own streets, where memorials were defaced, where synagogues were torched, where cemeteries were vandalized, where Jewish institutions found themselves under assault, the whole leading to an alarming rise both in hate crimes and an alarming rise in incendiary hate speech of an unprecedented character, where in 1 week, in the wake of the Hamas war against Israel, we had 17,000 tweets that Hitler was right. And there's been a third pandemic. The third pandemic, and I once addressed your group on this, but that has also intensified, and that's the global political pandemic, characterized by a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, the assault on human rights, and political prisoners as a looking glass into that assault. I shared with your group the case of Nasrin Sotoudeh, and you were kind enough to take up the case of this iconic Iranian woman human rights lawyer who's gone down the line, not only for the struggle for women's rights, but for every other human rights struggle in Iran. But recently, we found we've been engaged in an incredible case on the 20th anniversary of the imprisonment of the longest imprisoned journalist in the world. His case is not on the radar screen, but something you might want to consider taking up. I'm speaking about the Swedish Eritrean journalist, Dwight Isaac, who along with his colleagues was arrested 20 years ago and since then has been denied any visits from his family, any consular access, any right to a lawyer, any right to a hearing, has not only been tortured in detention, but has been effectively, forcibly disappeared. And since Canada, at the beginning of 2021, led the way for now 65 countries to sign on to the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention to combat hostage diplomacy, and this is what it is with dual nationals, then this is an excellent case study that you might want to consider taking up, and I'll be happy to share any information with you on that. And this leads to the pandemic, the fourth pandemic, and that is the pandemic of impunity. Instead of securing justice for victims and accountability for human rights violators, we are indulging impunity. We are incentivizing human rights violators, whether that be in Iran, which shortly after Iran sentenced Nasrin Sotoudeh to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, Iran remarkably 2 days later was elected to the UN Commission on Women's Rights. Similarly, with respect to Dwight Isaacs, we have a situation where Eritrea is ranked 180 out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index and has yet to have any of its senior officials sanctioned under Magnitsky sanctions for this ongoing, what some have called being a crime against humanity. And similarly, with regard to anti-Semitism, the main theme of my remarks this morning, we have indulged it, we have acquiesced in it, we have incentivized it, and we have enabled it. And I'm going to be using the Durban, the legacy of Durban as a case study in that regard. I have to say, when I first heard in 1997 that there was going to be a world conference against racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, I greeted this news with great interest and anticipation. This was going to be the first world conference against racism of the 21st century. This was going to be indeed the first international human rights conference of the 21st century, with anti-racism as its organizing theme, and giving an opportunity for the targets of racism, whether they be the Dalits, and I can go on, all the persecuted groups would finally be able to have a voice. And it was going to be taking place in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of South African apartheid, where in 1981, I actually had been arrested in South Africa during the course of giving a talk on Mandela. And so for me, this is the 40th anniversary of that arrest, and that brings back its own sense of memory and sense of impunity. But what happened at Durban, if I can use an oft-abused metaphor, but there's no other one to so fully express what happened. What happened at Durban was truly Orwellian. A world conference against racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. A world conference for the promotion and protection of human rights singled out one people, the Jewish people, one state, Israel, for selective opprobrium and indictment. And a conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa turned into a conference calling for the dismantling of the apartheid state Israel. As someone who participated in that Durban conference, I was a member of the Canadian government delegation, but I attended and participated also in the NGO forum at Durban. I have to say that Durban has indelibly imprinted itself not only on my memory, but also on my being. I can still see the marches. I can still hear the chants. I can still see the posters and emblems that Zionism is racism and Israel is Nazism. I can still hear, as I said, the chants with thousands of demonstrators in the streets chanting that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Those of us who personally witnessed this Durban festival of hate have been forever transformed by the pamphlets and posters of hatred and anti-Semitism, by the cartoons and the leaflets portraying not only the Jews as Nazis, but the classical anti-Semitic tropes of Jews with hooked noses, of fangs with fingers dripped in blood from the killing of children, where we were accosted with pamphlets of the protocols of the elders of Zion, where we witnessed demonstrators with signs, incredibly, for a human rights conference or for any conference, signs which said, "Too bad Hitler didn't finish the job," where we witnessed Jewish students and eyewitnesses personally being physically assaulted and being told, "You don't belong to the human race," just as Jewish NGO representatives like yourselves, being a Jewish NGO, were told, "You don't belong to the human rights." Durban, therefore, is part of our everyday lexicon, a byword for hate and anti-Semitism, in the same way that 9/11 is a byword for terrorism and mass murder. And I have to tell you that I returned from Durban to Canada on the evening of September 10th, I awoke on September 11 to 9/11, to the horrifics of 9/11. And later that day, one of my fellow delegates at the Durban NGO forum called me and summed it up in a pithy sentence that I've never forgotten, when she said that 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, but Durban was the Mein Kampf. That Durban was the blueprint of hate. It should not be surprising that this Durban Festival of Hate became a legitimizing instrument for a new wave of anti-Semitism in the immediate aftermath of Durban, and which persists to this day, which has metastasized and persists to this day. But let me give you a snapshot of what happened in the immediate aftermath of Durban, which began, as I say, and became the tipping point for the beginning of a demonological anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism which portrayed Israel as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state. All these epithets of hate that we are experiencing today began in Durban. And in the immediate aftermath of Durban, Jews were blamed for 9/11 itself in a new set of protocols, reflecting the international conspiracy theories that began to be current at the time. A global campaign against Israel, as I mentioned, with all these demonological epithets, was launched at Durban in an organized, orchestrated way. The first UN Commission on Human Rights, as it was then called, now the UN Council on Human Rights, met in the immediate aftermath of Durban and singled out Israel for selective indictment, and a program where more resolutions were passed against Israel in the immediate aftermath of Durban at that UN Commission, a process that has replicated itself to this day, than against the rest of the world combined. A meeting at the University of Michigan to launch the BDS movement. Yes, it was launched then, the immediate aftermath of Durban in November of 2011. And listen to this, a resolution at that University of Michigan meeting that called for the recognition of two states if Israel were to become a democracy was defeated, problematic enough, and replaced by a call for the ending of Israel as an apartheid state. And this was within the framework of the, in effect, launching of the BDS movement. And perhaps the most egregious and hateful demonstration of demonological anti-Semitism under the cover of international human rights law, under the cover of international humanitarian law, occurred several months after, in December 2011, where the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the repository of international human rights and humanitarian law, met for the first time. The Geneva Convention was adopted in 1949. Now, in 2001, in the aftermath of Durban, the contracting parties come together for the first time in 52 years to put one state in the docket of the accused. And what state is that? It is not any of the states that were committing or had been committing mass atrocities at the time. There was no reference to China. There was no reference to Russia. There was no reference to those who had been responsible for the genocide of the Tutsis or the murder of Muslims in former Yugoslavia, or what was happening, the ethnic cleansing in Darfur. No, the only state, I repeat, the only state singled out, put in the docket of the accused in the immediate aftermath of Durban for violations of international humanitarian law was Israel. And I might add, to show you how that pattern of the launching of demonological anti-Semitism has continued, twice since then, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention have met, and in both those occasions, yet again, put only one state in the docket of the accused, and that state is Israel. 20 years later, the Durban legacy of hate finds expression not only in the old, new, escalating, global, virulent, sophisticated, and lethal anti-Semitism, not only in the metastasizing of anti-Semitism in the wake of the Hamas war, which became, if you will, a second tipping point, as I referenced earlier, but where this demonological anti-Semitism is underpinned by 5 dynamics that we don't always appreciate, but as a group that is at the forefront of the struggle for human rights, one needs to appreciate the backdrop of these dynamics. The first is the mainstreaming, the normalization, in effect, the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, the utter absence of outrage at what I've been sharing with you, indeed, the indifference and inaction to these patterns of demonological anti-Semitism. The second is the globalization of anti-Semitism, where what happens in Paris and London reverberates, if you will, from Montreal to Toronto, Halifax to Vancouver. And not only reverberates, but replicates itself. Right after a convoy in the streets of London in the United Kingdom was going through the streets saying, F the Jews will rape your daughters, a similar convoy was right here in Canada going through the streets saying the same thing, F the Jews will rape your daughters. So these things are not only accidental, they are part of orchestrated, organized, anti-Semitic demonological phenomenon. And the third is, regrettably, the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against anti-Semitism itself. I can give you many examples, but an advisory panel set up by the Department of Defense to look into racism in the Department of Defense, looked into all other forms of racism. The only one that it didn't look into and did not list as part of the struggle against racism was anti-Semitism. Similarly, under global affairs, education and training with respect to combating all the racisms that I referred to before, the systemic racism, which we do and need to combat, there was no reference in that to anti-Semitism. And I can give other examples. So what you have, therefore, is the marginalization, or sometimes even exclusion, of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism. The fourth thing is the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism itself, where Jews are held out to be part of the white privileged or even oppressor class, as Israel is held out to be part of the oppressor state in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the convergence of the two, and where the demonizing of Israel leads to the demonizing of the Jew in North America. And finally, as I mentioned, the revival of the classic anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as poisoners of the wells, of which COVID-19 is but one example. Now, none of this is intended to suggest that somehow Israel should be above the law, or that Israel deserves a particular or privileged position because of the horrors of the Holocaust, or because of the ongoing persecution. Not at all. The problem is not that anyone should seek that Israel be above the law, but Israel and the Jewish people are systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that Israel should respect human rights, but that the human rights of which is something that one can call upon every state to do, but that Israel's rights deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards are being applied to Israel, which they should be, but these standards are not being applied equally to everyone else. On the contrary, Israel, as I sought to share with you, has and continues to be singled out for selective opprobrium and indictment. And this is being done under the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights and under the very struggle against racism itself, as I mentioned. Accordingly, it was welcome that the Canadian government convened a national summit to combat anti-Semitism on July 21st, the first summit of its kind that was held and is yet to be held by any country. And participating in that summit were the Prime Minister, 10 government ministers, parliamentarians, leaders of civil society, and a diverse representation from the Jewish community. But I have to say, the lived testimonies of this diverse representation from the Jewish community was perhaps the most important part of that summit, and one that had a real and moving impact on the participants. I may use as one example. Prime Minister Trudeau gave opening remarks to the summit, but after he heard the following two testimonies, he was visibly moved. And the two testimonies were, one, a student at the University of Toronto who described how he and his fellow Jewish students were being marginalized, bullied, excluded from the campus culture, unless in order to be part of the quote unquote progressive campus culture, they would effectively renounce their Jewish identity or that which was central to their Jewish identity. And similarly, a Jewish woman of color described how, in effect, she embodied intersectionality, but she was being targeted not only as a woman, not only for being Black, but targeted in particular because of her anti-Semitism. And Anna Marie Paul, the leader of the Green Party, also has given similar expression to that sentiment. After these two lived testimonies, the Prime Minister responded, and this was a spontaneous response at the time. And he said to you, I said, I've heard you, and I want to tell you that we will continue to combat the 3 Ds, namely the demonization of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel, and double standards. And we will make the combating of anti-Semitism at the forefront of our struggle for human rights and human dignity. And I suspect that that fed into the country pledges that Canada made now last week at the Malmo International Forum in Malmo, Sweden, on Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Those pledges will soon be published in the full. Prime Minister has given a talk, and others have on that. And as I shared with participants at the National Summit, and also recently last week at the Malmo Summit, may I share with you and move to a conclusion with what can be a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, that the National Council on Jewish Women can play an important role, and an important role also in mobilizing what I call an allyship, in bringing together other women's groups and bringing together other advocates for human rights, as you did with regard to journalists and the like, in order to create a critical mass of advocacy to combat anti-Semitism. As this is a very learned group, what I'm going to do is just give you that, share that action plan in a series of almost one-liners, because you could all fill it in beyond what I'll be saying to you. The first is the importance of Holocaust education and education about anti-Semitism. And in the Prime Minister's speech and in country pledges, he said, we will enhance teaching and learning about the Holocaust across generational lines. And the reasons for this, as I set forth at the conference as well, was because the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, as anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism itself did not die at Auschwitz, and it remains the bloodied canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. A comment that the Prime Minister quoted during his speech to the Malmo conference. The second is the importance of combating the increasing Holocaust denial and distortion. And I made some reference to it before, but if you look to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, they have not only recommendations regarding teaching and learning on the Holocaust, the first objective I mentioned, but also as to how to combat Holocaust denial and distortion. And I refer you to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance recommendations in that regard. I also want to mention that the Azrieli Foundation has just published a booklet called First Steps, which is a primer for high school teachers teaching the Holocaust. This is particularly important and relevant because studies have shown that 50% of millennials can't name one concentration camp, can't name Auschwitz or ever heard of Auschwitz, the brutal extermination camp, most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century. And that, as they have pointed out, that many of those teaching the Holocaust are not confident about doing so because they find they get most of their information from the social media platforms. But the social media platforms from which are to get their information are these days replete with Holocaust denial and distortion memes. And you have a situation where, as a recent study showed, 84% of anti-Semitic material posted on these platforms is not taken off. And so another concern that I'll address to as part of the National Action Plan. So a third thing at this point is exposing and unmasking the Durban legacy of hate, as I've shared with you, that has metastasized and was the first tipping point for the new global anti-Semitism that we have been experiencing, while the Hamas war became the second. A fourth is the need, therefore, to use the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition on anti-Semitism as an important resource, tool, asset for recognizing and identifying anti-Semitism. As one says, if you can't define it, you can't combat it. That IRA working definition, and I say this as one who was present at the creation, who was part of the drafting team to bring it about, this IRA working definition is not only the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition we have, it's the most representative. It was one that was adopted after a 15-year period of democratic discussion and debate by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, scholars, civil society leaders, and the like. And I'm pleased that here too, the Prime Minister, as part of country pledges at the Malmo Forum last week, said that we fully support the work of IRA and we fully support the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, just as President Biden has said, we champion the IRA definition on anti-Semitism, and both Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden have both said, and Prime Minister Trudeau repeated last week in the country pledges, we will seek to get other countries to adopt that definition as we mainstream it within our own Canadian culture. Which leads me to a fifth, and I'll move more quickly to a close, the importance of parliamentary principles and precedents in the combating of anti-Semitism that are too little known, but are particularly important. I'm referring here to the London Declaration to Combat Anti-Semitism of the Interparliamentary Conference to do so in London in 2009, and the Ottawa Protocol to Combat Anti-Semitism adopted unanimously at the Ottawa Interparliamentary Conference to Combat Anti-Semitism in 2010, which contains word for word the various metrics that then became part of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. So there's a distinguishable Canadian component in all this. And so when you reference the Canadian Parliamentary Principles and Precedence with respect to combating anti-Semitism, you are also utilizing the distinguishable role that Canada can play and is playing in your mobilizing advocacy efforts as a National Council for Jewish Women. And I might mention in that another resolution that is not known, but in February 2015, the Canadian House of Commons unanimously adopted a resolution which had three parts, and very quickly, part one was alarmed at the global escalation in anti-Semitism. I don't have to tell you what has happened since. Second, called on the Canadian government to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in our domestic and foreign policy. So we are on record, Parliament, unanimously, with respect to calling on the government to making it a priority in our domestic and foreign policy. Again, this is something that you can use in your advocacy. And finally, it said, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. Number six at this point is combating the alarming rise in hate crimes. One statistic, 2020 was the year for the highest rise in hate crimes targeting Jews ever. But by May 2021, we had reached the level then of all the hate crimes in all of 2020. Secondly, and this is with regard to, let's say in that sense, a seventh objective, combating the incendiary hate on the social media. And as one of our country pledges, we have pledged to introduce legislation to combat the incendiary hate on the in the social media, and also for accountability for social media platforms. The eighth is protecting the security of Jewish institutions in all its respects. And here the government recently made commitments in financial terms for this purpose. The ninth is zero tolerance for anti-Semitism in and amongst our political cultures and parties. That means not just calling out anti-Semitism in the other's political party, but calling out anti-Semitism in our own. In other words, not weaponizing anti-Semitism or politicizing it, but holding each of us respectively, our own political parties accountable. The 10th thing in this regard is, as I mentioned, the country pledges. This also is a blueprint for you to use as part of the National Action Plan. It will be fully published next week by Sweden. You'll see not just Canadian country pledges, but from other countries. So this will give you an inventory of country pledges to rely on. And finally, what has been said by Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies. It's an assault on our common humanity. And therefore, we should see the combating of anti-Semitism as part of the larger struggle as well for the promotion and protection of democracy and human rights. So let there be no mistake about it. And I end where I began, that regrettably, we have been witnessing the indulgence, the acquiescence in, and in fact, relating to anti-Semitism with a sense of imbuing it with a culture of impunity. We have to hold anti-Semitism and anti-Semites accountable. And the struggle against anti-Semitism, as recognized again in Malmo, cannot be fought, let alone be won, by Jews alone. It is a responsibility of all governments, including our own, of all parliaments, of all civil society. Because, as mentioned at Malmo, and with this I close, anti-Semitism is an assault on our common humanity. It is, at this point, as it always has been, the canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And as we've learned only too painfully and have repeated too often, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And therefore, we need this collective, global constituency of conscience to combat it. And you, as a leading group, a leading NGO, can help mobilize for that objective. Thank you.
Professor Dr. Cotler, assembled members, board members of National Council of Jewish Women of Canada, and honor guests. I'm Ncjwc'S, and I represent the national portfolio, which focuses on anti-Semitism and anti-racism. Professor Cotler, I'm speaking for all of us when I thank you for your address on this timely and ever-pressing issue of anti-Semitism. I thank you for your tireless work and sober message today, which is all the while tinted with hope and inspiration. I thank you for words which strike a chord of recognition and acknowledgement of human rights globally. I thank you for propelling us to action, to greater involvement. I thank you for sending home the message that we must not accept the normalization of anti-Semitism anywhere. I thank you for forcing us to see that we cannot at any time be indifferent to anti-Semitism, that we must not be afraid to express outrage when we come face to face with it. I thank you, Professor Cotler, for providing us with lots to think about and a 10-point blueprint, as I see, for action. We will take up the challenge as best we can. We will. I thank you. I thank you. I thank you. And now, before I sign off, I'd like to remind all of us, members of the board, that we can resume our AGM Zoom meeting, which I hope will resume momentarily. And Debbie, if you have something to say, by all means do so. But again, thank you. And I just feel like unmuting everybody, all 81 participants, and giving you, Professor Cotler, a round of applause.
Bianca, go ahead. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Cotler. Your words really resonate with all of us, and we will do something. So you've gotten us all excited, as you always do, to do some good work. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing you again. So thank you, and the people that are coming back to our meeting, please get off this Zoom and go back to the original. And I'll see you all in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.